wind howled across the open plains like it had something to say, rattling the loose boards of Ethan Cole's cabin as dusk settled in. Ethan had lived alone for nearly a decade. Ever since the land became quieter than his heart, his days followed a simple rhythm: sunrise, cattle, repairs, silence. People in town said he liked it that way. But the truth was simpler. Life had taught him not to expect much from anyone. So when a knock echoed against his cabin door that evening, sharp and desperate, it felt like the land itself had made a mistake. Ethan froze. Nobody came out this far unless they were lost or broken. He opened the door cautiously, the lamplight spilling onto a woman standing barefoot in the dirt road, her white dress stained with dust and tears. Her veil hung torn from her hair, and her eyes, wide, hollow, shaking, looked straight through him like she was afraid he might disappear too. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind tugged at her dress, and Ethan noticed her hands trembling, clutching the fabric as if it was the last thing holding her together. "I'm sorry," she whispered finally, her voice barely louder than the wind. "I didn't know where else to go." Ethan recognized her then. Clara Whitmore, his neighbor's bride, or at least she had been supposed to be. The whole town had buzzed about the wedding for weeks. Flowers, guests, laughter promised in a place that rarely celebrated anything. And yet here she stood, abandoned miles from town, knocking on the door of a man people barely spoke to. Ethan stepped aside without a word, the old floorboards creaking as she hesitated, then crossed the threshold like someone entering another world. Inside, the cabin was warm but sparse. One table, 2 chairs, a fireplace with embers still glowing. Clara looked around as if she expected something terrible to leap out at her, but nothing did. Just quiet, safe, unfamiliar quiet. She sank into the chair nearest the fire, the strength leaving her all at once. And for the first time since she arrived, she began to cry, not softly, but the kind of sobbing that comes from holding pain in for far too long. Ethan didn't know what to do. Comfort wasn't a skill he'd practiced, so he did the only thing he knew. He made tea, set it in front of her, and waited. When her breathing finally slowed, she told him everything. How the groom never showed. How whispers spread through the church like smoke. How her family avoided her eyes. How she ran before anyone could see her break. By the time she finished, the fire had burned lower, and Ethan felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not pity, but anger on her behalf. "You can stay," he said simply. "As long as you need." Clara looked up at him in disbelief. "Why?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Ethan met her gaze. "I know what it's like to be left." That night she slept on his spare bed while Ethan sat awake by the fire, listening to the wind and wondering how one knock had changed everything. He didn't know it yet, but the town was already talking. By morning, rumors would spread faster than wildfire, and people would start asking questions they weren't ready to hear. But inside that small cabin, something fragile and powerful had begun, something neither of them could walk away from. If you're still with this story right now, it means you understand how one moment can change a life. Stories like this unfold piece by piece. And if you don't want to miss what comes next, this is the perfect time to subscribe and stay with us until the very end. The town didn't wait long. By the second day, riders passed Ethan's land more often than usual, slowing just enough to confirm the rumors. An abandoned bride, a lonely cowboy, a cabin full of unanswered questions. Clara noticed the looks first, the way people stared when Ethan rode into town for supplies, the silence that followed him like a shadow. Guilt gnawed at her, but Ethan brushed it off. "Let them talk," he said. "They always do." What no one knew was what happened behind that cabin door. Clara didn't act like someone who needed rescuing. She woke early, helped with chores, learned the land like she'd been born to it. Slowly, laughter returned to her voice, hesitant at first, then real. Ethan found himself listening for it, realizing how long it had been since his home felt alive. And Clara saw something in Ethan the town never had, a man who carried loss quietly, who gave without asking, who never once looked at her like she was something broken. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the plains gold, Clara finally asked the question that had lingered between them. "Why did you really help me?" Ethan stared out at the horizon for a long time before answering. He told her about his wife, how she'd died young, how the town moved on while he stayed stuck in the silence. Helping Clara, he admitted, had reminded him that kindness still mattered, even when it hurt. The truth shocked her, and then, in a twist neither of them expected, the groom who abandoned Clara arrived at the cabin. desperate and defensive, demanding explanations. What he found instead was a woman transformed, strong, steady, unafraid, and a cowboy who stood beside her without hesitation. Clara told him no, not with anger but with certainty. She had learned her worth in the unlikeliest of places. When the man left, defeated and exposed, the town's story changed. Whispers turned into respect, and slowly, people realized that what happened inside that cabin wasn't scandal, it was healing. Months later, as winter crept in, Ethan and Clara stood together watching the first snowfall. Their story wasn't loud or dramatic. It was built on shared mornings, quiet trust, and the courage to open a door when life knocks unexpectedly. The shock wasn't that a cowboy took in an abandoned bride, it was that two broken lives found wholeness where no one thought it possible. And if this story moved you even a little, imagine the next one. Subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that start with a single knock on a door. Winter settled over the plains slowly, like it was giving Ethan and Clara time to decide who they wanted to be when the world thawed again. Snow softened the land, muffling old echoes, and the cabin, once just a shelter, began to feel like something closer to home. Not because either of them said it out loud, but because of the quiet ways they moved around each other now. 2 cups set out instead of 1, extra wood chopped without being asked, shared silence that didn't ache anymore. The town noticed the change before either of them did. When Ethan rode in, people greeted him by name. When Clara walked beside him, heads nodded instead of turning away. The abandoned bride was no longer a rumor. She was a woman who had chosen herself. And Ethan was no longer the grieving cowboy people pitied. He was the man who had stood up when it mattered. One afternoon, a letter arrived addressed to Clara. She held it for a long time before opening it, her hands steady but her eyes uncertain. It was from her family, apologies, regret, invitations to come home. Ethan said nothing, but Clara felt the question hanging in the air. That night she sat by the fire and read the letter again, then folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. "This is my home now," she said softly. Ethan looked at her, truly looked at her, and realized the shock everyone talked about wasn't the scandal, or the gossip, or the confrontation. The real shock was this: how love could grow not from grand promises, but from choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. Spring eventually returned. Flowers pushed through thawing soil, stubborn and bright. On a clear morning, Ethan took Clara to the ridge overlooking the land. No speeches, no rehearsed words, just honesty. He told her he didn't want to be her rescue story. He wanted to be her future, if she'd have him. Clara laughed through tears and said yes before he could finish. When they returned to town together weeks later, it wasn't for a wedding that needed proving. It was for a life already lived, already earned. The same people who once whispered now smiled, understanding at last that what happened inside that cabin wasn't shocking because it was scandalous, but because it was rare. And if you've made it this far, you already know why stories like this matter. They remind us that kindness can rewrite endings, and that sometimes the door you open for someone else changes your life too. If you want more stories that stay with you long after they end, make sure you're subscribed, because the next one might be the one you didn't know you needed. Years passed the way seasons do on the plains, quietly, steadily, leaving their mark only if you paid attention. Ethan's cabin no longer stood alone against the horizon. The fence was stronger now, the fields better kept, laughter echoed where silence once ruled. Clara had a way of bringing warmth into places that had long forgotten it, and Ethan learned that love didn't erase grief, it gave it somewhere safe to rest. They never rushed the milestones people expected. No spectacle, no town-wide announcement. When they married, it was beneath an open sky with the land as their witness. A few neighbors came, a few stayed away. It didn't matter. What mattered was the way Ethan looked at Clara, like the world had finally returned something it once took from him, and the way Clara stood beside him, not rescued, not saved, but chosen. The cabin became a place people talked about for a different reason now. Travelers stopped by when storms rolled in. Lost souls found shelter without questions. Ethan and Clara never asked for explanations. They understood too well how fragile a life could become in a single day. The abandoned bride and the lonely cowboy had quietly built something the town never expected: a refuge. One evening, a young girl arrived with her father, both shaken by loss, both unsure of where they belonged. Clara gave the girl a blanket. Ethan gave the man work, and as the fire crackled, Clara realized the truth that finally made her smile through tears. Her pain had not been the end of her story. It had been the beginning of someone else's survival. The town eventually stopped calling it the cabin where it happened. It became known simply as a place where people were treated right, where doors opened, where second chances weren't questioned. And long after the gossip faded, long after memories blurred, one thing remained clear. What happened inside that cabin shocked everyone because it proved something rare, that compassion could outlive shame, and kindness could outgrow tragedy. And if this story has stayed with you, if it's made you pause or feel something real, then you already understand why we tell stories like this. Subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because the next story might remind you that even the hardest beginnings can lead somewhere beautiful.